Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club for one of our 10th anniversary events, looking at 10 years on the front line. I will hand you over to Jon Snow in just a second. If I can ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live. So over to Jon.
Well, good evening, everybody. And 10 years on, the men still dominate on the panel. There's still only one woman. That's because all the other women are in the field.
Yes.
I've just been talking to Lindsay Hilsum she was supposed to be here, but she's in Syria. And we're very lucky to have Lise Doucette, who is not in Syria, but was almost immediately before this. And Shoaib Sharifi, who is an Afghan journalist who has very kindly stepped in for Gaith. He was editor of the state-run daily, the Kabul Times, producer, presenter for Radio Television Afghanistan, bureau chief of the UN agency IRIN News, freelance producer, director of many documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4, PBS America and ABC Australia. Lise Doucette, who needs no second introduction. Anthony Lloyd, award-winning correspondent writer. He's currently roving foreign correspondent for the Times, author of My War Gone By, I Miss It So. Bill Neely, international editor, ITV News, but not for much longer. He's defected to NBC for an absolutely megalithic football transfer sum. He's covered Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan floods, earthquake in Haiti, Arab uprising in Libya, Egypt, Syria, anything else that's been cooking in the last 10 years. So the idea is we're going to just talk very briefly, I think, about the key points for the last 10 years. Then we're going to throw it open. Then we're going to talk about what heralds the next 10 years, so that we have something futuristic to end on. So let me start with you, Anthony. For a start, I don't think any of us thought that from the moment the Frontline Club opened to this present day, Britain would be at war non-stop. It's an amazing thought. The longest period of continuous warfare, I think, in the last 150 years.
Just thanks for that. Yes. Well, we're sure pulling out the idea of going to war anymore very quickly. I think, looking back on the last 10 years, there are many stories one can think of, personally, having worked in the field of war for this long, that might be significant. But one which occurred recently for me, which echoes of Britain going to war or not going to war, was in Syria this year in April, when I heard word of a chemical attack by the regime in Aleppo. And for those of us who had been working in Syria at the time, this was not the first of its type. This was part of a growing trend of attacks by the regime, testing the resolve of the West, particularly America, and Obama's talk of a red line over the use of chemical weapons. I went to investigate this particular attack. Fortunately, it was quite easy to find. It was in a contested area of Aleppo. And I found that indeed a chemical shell had crashed through an apartment block and had gassed a family to death. This was 7 months before the August attacks in Ghouta. I found survivors from the street, people in the street who rushed to help the family and who had then gone down with the effects of what was later proven to be nerve gas. And I went to the hospital who had treated the family and got some video footage of the family as they were treated, frothing at the mouths, pinpointed pupils, etc. Fragments of the device used and from samples subsequently went to Porton Down and were tested positive for sarin. I was very surprised 6 months later, when the Ghouta atrocity occurred and hundreds of people were killed by nerve gas, to find that Britain, though it's Britain that had gone into Iraq, that had gone into Afghanistan, couldn't get the parliamentary vote going on whether even to agree on the principle of intervention in the case of Syria on the back of the Ghouta chemical attack. And it's incidental how I feel about it, but that parliamentary vote on the back of that chemical attack and that massacre signified to me quite the full circle that Britain has turned on its militaristic ventures, whether you go for them or you don't go for them, since getting involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. And intervention has been given a bad name, whether you support it or not.
Thank you, Anthony. Shoaib.
It was the early days of Frontline Club, maybe perhaps my first visit of the UK, and maybe the second or third year that Afghanistan had freedom of expression for the first time ever after decades of different regimes. So I thought, what a wonderful idea to open something like this in Afghanistan. Then when I went back home, I said, well, the situation was as such that I thought there will be no front line in Afghanistan. These things may not make a business, it may not be too attractive. Unfortunately, 10 years now, we have so many front lines, up to 300 people on average get killed because of war. I started journalism by the emergence of Taliban in 96, so when I was 17. So I have been to so many front lines. But I would like to briefly talk about the one which I went recently, not quite recent, 3 years ago. In the autumn of 2009, when Barack Obama announced the 30,000 US troop surge to Afghanistan. So I decided me and another Afghan journalist and a non-Western journalist, we decided to go and see the other side of the front line, the Taliban, because many times we are either on embed or we are just reporting it rather than physically experiencing what's happening the other side. So after very long communication and even getting sort of a permission, a green light from the Taliban's Quetta Shore, we went to in the eastern province of Afghanistan called Kunar, a very, very hot kind of front line, as the Americans call it, the Death Valley. Just 300 meters down an American base, we were stopped by an Afghan army, armed men appearing in Afghan army uniforms. Still, we are like another 8 hours from the point of contact. These people took us to a riverbed, so anyway, we immediately realized that they were a Taliban group, and so they took us for 8 hours, and after 8 hours, we realized that we were being taken hostage or kidnapped. So these were the people that we had actually opened, the people we were meant to see, but unfortunately the commander that had given us a green light was wounded or killed just a day before our visit by an American raid. So the people thought that we were spies, and we imprisoned in a very top of the mountain in a very, 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 very cold weather. And they said they will investigate for 3 days, and if we were spies, we will be exactly this word, our heads will be chopped. Otherwise, then they will know what will happen. So after 3 days of very, really sort of their way of investigation, no torture, but they accepted that we were not spies. So the man came, I'm just saying the brief story, that the good news is that you're not spies, so but the bad news is you're not going to be released. The man said, because even though you're not spies, but we have a very, very deep enmity with you guys, particularly referring to us two Afghans, and that's it, because you are the people of Tarmac. Tarmac referring to urban people. He said in the last 10 years, as well as in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, whatever have any development that have experienced this country, you, the people of Tarmac, have snatched it from us, taken that opportunity from us. The only development that we have experienced in this valley have been pointing to the AK-47 Kalashnikov that maybe our forefathers had sword and now we have AK-47. The rest, as you can see, the living situation here, from the last 8 hours that you walk in this valley, there's no development, nothing, not in the last 10 years, but we have a very deep enmity, and the only way to take revenge is to keep you people or get the money by force anyway. During this really, really hot 8 days, that for 3 days we were waiting for beheading, it was really hard, but as a journalist, I really learned this word really seemed very simple, but after release I thought about this being the people of Tarmac. As a journalist also, in the last 10 years, how much we have focused on the people of Tarmac, or urban people, rather than covering the front lines or the war by embeds or by non-true direct contact with people. I think I kind of feel even as journalists we have kind of not made an effort to meet the people of non-Tarmac and make stories. During these 8 days, I experienced how much really those people have really been forgotten. They even asked me on one occasion, one of our captors' wife was pregnant, and he came to me and said, my wife is expectant. I said, well, what can I do? Shall I say congratulations? I didn't know what to say. He said, I know, because again, you people of Tarmac, your mother must have been to hospital, your wife must have been to hospital. Tell me, what can we do? She is dizzy, she feels bad. I know you know something. And I sensed and experienced during 8 days, I'm talking now as an Afghan journalist and also as an Afghan, that I really felt that we were the urban people, the people of Tarmac, that how much these people suffered. And they were not really fanatic Taliban. I mean, when they were leading the prayers, they didn't even care a lot about religion, but their enmity, why they had gun was because they felt ignored.
Very powerful. Thank you very much. Very, very good. Bill.
Well, I mean, I feel quite humbled by that story, because you live your story every day. We three fly in and we try our best, and then we fly out again and we go back in, but ultimately it's a completely different kind of journalism. Look, I've tried my best, and I think we all have. I love your stuff. I read it, and I put it away, and I think that was just a marvelous piece of journalism. We really do try our best. And I feel, BBC, Channel 4 News, I think we're a good press corps. I really think, we do our best. But, in many respects, I think we've failed in the last 10 years. And I think we need to be damn humble about what we do and what we fail to do. Because so many times, like intelligence agencies and diplomats and governments, we've got it wrong. We've got it wrong. I mean, we did 2001 in Afghanistan, and the Taliban fell, and we walked away, and we went to Iraq. And somehow, behind our backs, the Taliban came back, and we didn't notice. And in Iraq, we covered a successful invasion, and I was embedded with troops, and we all risked our lives and so on. We did our best. And then somehow, the Brits lost Basra. The charge of the Knights was a campaign to take Basra back, which did not involve Britain. Who was there? I wasn't there. Very few of us were actually there, 2006, 2007. Libya, it was the fall of a cartoon dictator. It was all terribly good. Libya is a basket case now. Who was in Benghazi when Christopher Stevens was killed? By a mob, and remember the initial reports? It was because of a video. That's why he was killed, an angry mob. Where were those datelines from? Cairo, Washington, London. We weren't there, and as a result of us not being there, the policy was wrong, because Susan Rice and all those American diplomats caught the story and decided that was the narrative. Christopher Stevens was killed because of an angry mob. It wasn't that. It was 9/11 all over again. It was a mob. It was Al-Qaeda who was determined to kill an American ambassador. And we have Syria today. Did we get the narrative right in Syria? No, not at the beginning. We thought this was 1968 and 1989 all over again. It wasn't. So, I've tried my hardest. I've been there. I've been to Syria 9 times in the last 2 years. But I put my hand up and say, God, I've tried hard, but did I get it wrong? So, but picking, as we were asked to do, picking a highlight of the last 10 years, that's hard for me. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and the one lesson I learned in Northern Ireland, and I know there are a few people from the tortured province here, there you go, and what I learned there is that governments lie and governments kill. Your own state kills. Your own state lies. And so one thing that I was reasonably proud of was in 2006 we had John Reid, the then Secretary of Defence, saying that Britain was going to intervene in Helmand province, and he hoped not a single shot would be fired. What an obscene and appalling deception that was. Well, we were kept out, more or less, the British media, for the first few months that British troops were in Helmand. And I managed to get in, not on an embed, but by hook or by crook into Helmand in September 2006, and went to Sangin, where from dawn to dusk, British troops were under attack. I remember talking to people who were living in trenches, soldiers who were living in trenches, and guys saying, this is like World War I. And it was a constant barrage, and they almost ran out of ammunition. And by the time September was over, when I came back, almost 1 million bullets had been fired. And at least I was able then, and I felt quite pleased about it, to shine a light, which is what we're all ultimately trying to do, and to tell truth to power. No, John Reid, you did not succeed in your aim to intervene, and not as if you could in Afghanistan, and not a single bullet be fired. But you're 1 million bullets later, and we're still there, and troops are still dying. So, in one way, I tried my best, and I'm pleased that the British Press Corps does a good job. In another way, in the last 10 years, I think we need to be pretty humble about what we achieve.
Thank you, Bill. Very poignant, and I agree with it. Lise.
Let me just say a few words about the war that I sometimes describe as the war of our time, which is Syria, which is, as all of you would know here, and my colleagues who cover the story would know, it's a war in many wars. It's a civil war, a sectarian war. It's a war on children, a war on childhood. Some of you may have seen the Oxford Research Group, which has confirmed the terrible tale that children in Syria now are not just being caught in the crossfire, they're being targeted by snipers, summarily executed, and even tortured. It's a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis of this century, with the rate of refugee families fleeing the country increasing at a rate that we haven't seen for decades. It's also a proxy war with an existential battle between all of the regional power weights, all the regional heavyweights in the region along all the fault lines, including, of course, the Shia-Sunni split. It's a new Cold War as well, because it also goes through Moscow and Washington. And often, despite all of this, despite what is not just a war that is destroying a country, destroying people every day, the whole fabric of society is being ripped apart. And yet the narrative often comes down to the fate of one man. Is President Assad going to go? And if he doesn't go, the war will just get worse, and so will the humanitarian crisis. And I was thinking about the war today because, as John mentioned, I'm just back from Syria. And I was thinking about it as I rummaged through the storage room in my flat. So one of the programs I work for at the BBC NewsHour is marking its 25th year, and they wanted to have pictures of where we were 25 years ago. So it meant I was rummaging through my memories of when I was in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, which meant I was coming back to the very origins of the people who inspired the Frontline Club on 10 Canal Bank Road in Peshawar, where lived the young, handsome, single Vaughan Smith and Peter Juvenile, Rory Peck, all of these people. That is where they start. That is the distant origins of the men, the brave young men who went out into the war in Afghanistan, what was then an American-backed Mujahideen war against the Soviet-backed government in Kabul. So I was thinking about that. So I had these two wars going through my heads, and I came across the photographs that I had mounted on my wall in a hotel room in Kabul. I had first gone to Peshawar and Quetta, and then Christmas Eve of 1988, I flew into Kabul, and I ended up staying there a year. And as the photographers came and went, and what was, of course, the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and so headline pictures, front page pictures, the photographers who left, who came and went, would always leave me their best photographs. And I'd mounted them and put them in my room. And this is what I realized today as I went through my photographs. What was the war 25 years ago? It was a war on children terrified. It was a humanitarian war, petrol cans in the city in the beginning of a harsh winter. It was a war where even the women took up guns to fight against missiles fired by regional players. In this case, it was Pakistan. It was also a war about one man, and the title was, Can He Last? There's Najibullah. And of course, the answer was, of course he will last, because he's backed by Soviet troops. And I thought, haven't I heard something about that war before? And of course, I asked myself, what is it about, will we learn the lessons of history? And as one French philosopher said, the only lesson of history that we learn is that we don't learn the lessons of history. And I also found, sadly, a more happier one, in which in Syria, there are now, about 30 journalists who've been detained, and so many Western and Syrian and Arab journalists as well. This was an American journalist who was detained from Time magazine and from Washington Post, and I was living in Kabul, and I helped to get him out of detention, and so it was a happy day. So let me at least give a happy photograph of a journalist who got out of detention. But those are the two bookends of my career. I mean, I've been 30 years as a journalist, but there's the 25 years ago where I began working in Afghanistan until to this day, and a war in Syria, which sadly has all the remembrances and reflections, and some of them of the most heartbreaking kind, of a war at the end of the day, which is killing its most vulnerable and its youngest, the people who could do absolutely nothing to stop it.
Thank you, Lise, very much. Well, it's too frustrating for a chair not to enter some view of his own, so I'm going to take the license. I mean, I did report from some of the active front lines, like Iraq, etc., but the thing which sticks with me is the same obsession I had in the decade before the Frontline Club was formed, and that was Iran, which was its own front line in a very curious way. Shots may not have been fired, but the standoff with Iran was an extraordinarily dominant feature. And I went there perhaps 8 times during this decade, maybe a bit more. Indeed, we managed in 2006 to do a whole week of Channel 4 News direct from Iran, from 6 different cities. Absolutely unprecedented, completely against the grain. And I believe that we, again, very much in the same line as Bill describes, I think we fell into, or have fallen into, the trap of believing what the outside powers tell us. The demonization of Iran, easily done because they force-fed it themselves with Ahmadinejad, but too simplistic. A really vital state, a state that looks west. I mean, the people look west. They are westward looking. It's a 6,000-year-old civilization. They haven't just walked out of tents. And it's a beautiful country and an incredible people, unbelievably well educated. 60% of this year's university intake are women. And it's been on America and Israel and Saudi Arabia's front line throughout the decade. And we've never tried until right now to do anything about it. All we've wanted to do is to talk nuclear. And nuclear is a completely bankrupt conversation. The Iranians may or may not have been building a bomb, but it's a staggering fact that through all the intelligence devices that they have, and the Israelis know more about intelligence than anybody, nobody's been able to prove they're actually building a bomb. And nobody's actually been able to say, this is what's happening. There are centrifuges here, refining here, and whatever. But at the end of the day, people miss the trick. And the trick is that Iran is utterly pivotal to everything that we have been involved with in this period of 10 years. Afghanistan, critical. Without Iran, the Northern Alliance would never have been able to replace Massoud. Iran stepped into the breach, helped very much reorder that end of Iran, at that end of Afghanistan. Without Iran, we cannot resolve Syria. And in the meantime, this is where we do fail as journalists. We fail to talk truth to power. The truth to power is that much of what we have been dealing with in the last 10 years is the export of Wahhabism, is the thoroughgoing institutional, constitutional export of Wahhabism out of Saudi Arabia into Pakistan, into Yemen, into Somalia, into Niger, into Mali, you name it, it's there. There is not an American, a British, a NATO boot in action, covertly or overtly, anywhere in the world which is not up against material which is in some way sponsored by, armed by Saudi interests. And what are we doing? We are supplying jets. Thank you. So, having ranted on like that.
Are you drinking to that?
So, well, disagree with me.
driving men to drink.
Disagree with me. But I mean, the stupidest thing any of us could do is get involved in a Sunni-Shia war, and that's fortunately one thing they decided not to do when they decided not to intervene in Syria. But anyway, who would like to come in on anything? Oh, there's a forest. Well, as you're in the front row, and we favour the front row at the front line.
If as Bill said, and as you've said,
Name?
sorry, my name's Chris King. I'm a member of Frontline.
What do you do?
I write software.
Good man. Without you, we would never have been able to go to war.
And I take photographs at Frontline. Okay, if as you've been saying, there are failings in what you do, I've got two related questions. What can you do to address those failings? And given, as Bill said, that states lie and states kill, would the truth actually make any difference?
Bill?
Depends what you mean by the truth. Again, we do our best, but whether you're an embedded war correspondent or an independent war correspondent or wherever you are, you're only ever going to see just a slice. We fool ourselves sometimes that we can take the slice and draw big conclusions from it, and we all do it. We get into our place and we take a small incident, or we take a week, or we take a valley, or we take a hospital, and we try to draw bigger conclusions from it. But we have to be honest enough to see that that's all we're seeing. We're just seeing a slice. That governments, don't want us to see a great deal, and we won't get there. And it's not just North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia who don't let us in. Our own governments don't let us into the places where they don't want us to see. Whether it's Basra in 2007-8 when they were losing, and they didn't let us in. I mean, I personally was, blocked from from being anywhere near British troops at that time. Look, I think we have to keep banging our head against the wall. It's an uncomfortable thing to do, but we've got to do it.
I just want to interrupt and say that I don't share any of their humility at all. I honestly don't. I think we've done, by and large, as good a job as you can in an environment which war is ruled by the dynamic of chaos. It's almost impossible to get it right. It's particularly impossible to get it right when you're a journalist working for a newspaper or a television organisation which has X amount of money, Y amount of people to commit to Z amount of places. It's very finite resources. So I'm fully working for one of the Murdoch papers. I'm fully open to accepting failures, but I don't share the same sense of sort of hand-wringing, 10 years on, look at what we know. I think we've got an incredibly sophisticated society in Britain as a result of an incredibly sophisticated media. I think that the wars we've got involved with this country, namely Afghanistan and Iraq, I think that the society we live in is incredibly well informed as to what went wrong, how we were lied to, how we were duped, or some of the very real positive attributes of intervention in somewhere like Afghanistan and what the questions are today. And after the last 10 years, I certainly don't feel in any way ashamed of the way we've worked or how our society is informed. I think that you can never get it right as a journalist working in war. It's very, very impossible to do so. And I think we've got a very, very well-informed and sophisticated society that perpetually challenges the authorities as a result of the work journalists don't do. And if anyone's in any doubt of that, go and look at our roll call of dead journalists downstairs, please.
Just to be clear, I'm not ashamed of what we've not ashamed of what we've achieved. And the very first thing I said was, I think the British media generally has done as good as we possibly have. And yes, and I've lost friends. We've all lost friends, and they've laid down their lives. So all I was trying to do was just enter a fairly big caveat that I think, in spite of our best efforts, and like I said, I think your stuff's great, and Marie Colvin's, and et cetera, but I just think we have to be careful about what we've achieved and what we've failed.
But I think I would also argue for humility, but it is to remind ourselves that we are just the storyteller. we're not the story, and our job is to ask questions, and that's the best we can do. And we just have to keep asking questions, never stop asking questions. And I sometimes say when I finish an interview that the questions are more interesting than the answers, that if a person doesn't answer, if the answer is not good enough, then people will realize, though, that the question you asked, that you were hoping to find out some kind of information. And perhaps I fall back on that old truism that's been around almost as long as war, that we do the first rough draft of history. And sometimes it is very, very rough indeed. And I think the best measure against that, and I think I speak for everyone here on the panel, is that, and for a lot of you in the room, is that the only way to guard against not getting anywhere close to the truth is to, in addition to keep asking questions, keep going back to the same places and to build on each other. Because the wonderful thing about the world in which we live now is there's not just one television channel and one newspaper. There's a whole wealth of information, and I would hope that if you watch ITN and Channel 4, and you also read Anthony's pieces, and you also pay attention to local media as well, and you pay attention to the BBC, that you'll get a bigger picture, and you'll get also your own research that you get from either going to the place or reading about the place. So I think we do have to be humble, but I also think that there's some fantastic work has been done too under very difficult and dangerous conditions.
Perhaps it would be worth venturing that we at the Frontline Club and on the Frontline conceivably have been too obsessed with our silos, that actually the letdown in part has been from domestic American, British political correspondence. I mean, if you take the dodgy dossier, the correspondents, I'm afraid, at the beginning reported it tremendously as fact, because basically there was no real attempt in that very early stage by political correspondents to get hold of people who knew Iraq, who knew Afghanistan, who knew Iran, who knew these places, and say, hang on a minute, this is what they're saying. You say, 45 minutes? I'm sorry. Absolute bollocks. And most of us knew immediately that it was. But it came out as, this is a terrible threat, etc. This guy knows what he's talking about. Of course, we all subsequently, when we foreign correspondents got to actually cross-examine some of these people like Blair, I discovered that Blair in 2006, when Britain was moving sanctions against Iran, had never heard of the man we overthrew, Mossadegh. He'd never heard of Mossadegh. I said, we've got to think about what we did to Mossadegh. And he said, who is Mossadegh? That's a pretty staggering. You'd have thought the first sheet of A4 would inform you who Mossadegh was, because in paragraph 2 of any conversation with anybody in Iran, he is mentioned. Anyway, other questions from the floor?
I think, John, that's what we call in our business a story that's too good to check.
Too good to check.
Sex, sex stuff dossier, 45
Let me take
minutes.
you at the back, yes.
Thanks, really interesting discussion. I wouldn't be too hard on
Your name?
yourselves. My name's Sophie. I'm an environmental campaigner. My worry is not the great work that you do. My worry is the ever-shrinking media agenda on the news. And so many of us preach to the converted, and we're all here and we know the same, and we're interested. But I think there's probably a top 5 items that all mainstream news seems to lead and end with. And I think if we want to do anything or broaden the agenda or the horizons of the viewers, then we need to address the editors and get the news agenda to be more independent, more led by its reporters, and more diverse.
Thank you. Let me ask you, because that sort of flows from this, but we'll address it more specifically in a moment. But when we've gone, when we international journalists have gone, and when the New York Times or whoever it is stops ringing you, what's going to happen in Afghanistan? What's going to happen to you on the front line when we've all gone? Well, you'll run out of money for a start.
Because under the Taliban, you were almost not there, so we only had a few number of international journalists. But I would say somehow reporting of war under the Taliban was much, much better than what is happening in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, I don't think in the last 10 or 12 years, we as journalists, all nationals, internationals, have done anything significant that have affected the war. The internationals have continued the embed on one side of the war, the nationals, because they, even until now, our own Minister of Defense would not allow local journalists to go on embed, but foreigners are still through the Americans or the Brits would do. So I don't think if it will really have any significant impact on anything good happening right now. I just would like to add to the first question that if we compare at least in the last 3 or 4 decades of war, 3 decades of war in Afghanistan, again I would say we as journalists, from what I have heard and read and heard from war reporters, the last decades we could have done better had we not followed the lines of what makes 6 o'clock news, what makes the 10 o'clock. I was in the BBC, I was also working for the BBC news gathering in Kabul, and for some time I was suffering. I didn't know what it even didn't mean. Pitching a story, some good stories, let's go, there's such a story, so interesting, human touch story, and then I was hearing from the correspondent, I don't think if it will make the 6 o'clock news. So until I came to London, I said I want to physically go and see who the people on the 6 o'clock news that are making the agenda all the way down to Kabul. So the answer would be, I think,
But now there's so many Afghan media. There's like 70 channels in Kabul alone. In some ways, to tell their own story, Afghans don't need us anymore. They've got a whole wealth of channels, television channels, radio, newspapers, media.
Because the country still will be so close, dependent to international aid, and what draws attention of Afghanistan is again the internationals. But unfortunately, we, the international, now working for the international organization, have been really away from the real human side. When we say wars, it is one side of the war, the other side of the war, and then it's people. I think how much the war has affected, or is affecting, or the intervention is positively or negatively affecting hasn't been properly reported.
Yes, Paddy.
Can I really push this business of how sophisticated the British public is and the effect of war? Because, Anthony, this is a week in which we now know that the British Army operated a squad in Northern Ireland to eliminate British citizens. Now, I say this, I come from a Northern Irish Protestant background, so it's not a sectarian point at all, but I haven't been overwhelmed by the scenes of outrage that this has happened. And so I would like to link that with your point about the reaction to the, or non-reaction, as you may feel, to the situation of chemical warfare in Syria. Why do you think it is that the British public have not demanded? I heard a British former head of the army on the radio, on the Today programme, our leading current affairs programme, sorry, Channel 4, but, actually saying, well, so what, really? That's the kind of thing. I mean, and don't you think this is absolutely outrageous? And that here, operating in our name with taxpayers' money, was a British army operating a shoot-to-kill policy against people who may have been terrorists, but they're using exactly the same terror that we are objecting to. So I just wonder about your claim that we are very sophisticated.
I haven't seen the full panorama, but I must admit I was completely uncarried by the quotes I heard lifted on the Today programme by the soldier who was interviewed 35 years later. Probed. He came up with about 3 lines. And did you ever open fire on people who you believed to be armed? It was sort of like, yeah, if we believed them to be armed, we might have opened fire. Oh, some people might call that murder. Oh, yeah, some people, but I wouldn't. God, if I wrote a story like that, my editor would go back and tell me to fucking well stand it up and do some proper journalism. I was completely uncarried by the case. And when Mike Jackson, a guy General Mike Jackson, who I don't normally agree with, was interviewed on Today, I thought he batted it very well. He said, I think the guy was speaking out of bravado. I don't know. I don't feel that convinced by it. Now, if you're comparing a few quotes, I didn't think it was a very well-hit story at all. I haven't seen the full panorama report, but the BBC were top-ending with these quotes, which I would have sent someone back into the field and to work on again, with Ghouta, the massacre of hundreds of people, thousands of people gassed, with footage we can evidently see, and which a UN report, even when they're bending over backwards not to attribute blame, you can clearly see through the details they offer, has been conducted by the regime. And expect me to get cranked that we didn't get worked up on one hand, and also didn't on the other. I mean, it's just it's a non sequitur. I mean, I just don't go with. I'm quite prepared to believe that there were extrajudicial killings carried out by our government in Ireland. I wasn't particularly convinced by the Panorama story, but I mean, I think by and large people are very aware of what's going on in Northern Ireland. I think Bloody Sunday is, for one, and death squads is something which, amongst people who read newspapers, look at TV, which certainly isn't everybody. I think they can debate the sides very well in Northern Ireland, very well in Syria, not perfectly. But I'm not, I don't think the Panorama story is a great one in point as a test case.
Bill?
Well, again, I don't want this to come down to a discussion about Northern Ireland, but I think when you grow up as a journalist in Northern Ireland, your nerve endings are alive. And I think you take that into every conflict you subsequently go to. British troops and undercover people did kill ordinary civilians in Northern Ireland. The BBC banned documentaries, dozens of them, in Northern Ireland. We as journalists complied with the most absurd, because we had to, absurd regulations in Northern Ireland. Don't have Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams' voice on television, it has to be voiced by an actor. We connived in our great democracy in internment without trial, no jury courts. As a journalist, when you grow up and you see how democracy can be contorted, you're much more aware then of when a government says, oh, those bad people, that nasty Assad, that terrible Gaddafi. Look, I mean, there's no moral equivalence here, but as a journalist, you grow up with very acute sensory perceptions about, what your own government and the hypocrisy of your own government. So, I would love young journalists today to be aware of what Britain can do before it jumps on the bandwagon of how bad other regimes are. And that's a word I really try not to use. Regime, terrorist, please.
Well, I mean, in a way, this turns on its head what you were saying earlier, because it may be that because journalists have actually done a very good job, that the discovery that a few guys had gone around killing other British citizens in Northern Ireland on behalf of Her Majesty's armed forces and government is no surprise, because we knew it was a dirty, filthy war, because we reported it as such. And one remarkable thing is it's now become commonplace to talk about what a complete disaster the Afghan war has been. It's not controversial to say that Iraq was one of the worst military disasters of all time, and that it had infected the entire region and destabilized the entire region, that people who perpetrated it could conceivably be considered for war crimes and the rest of it. This is not controversial to say this. And that is because we did a good job, because we actually illustrated that this thing was damnable and wrong, and wrongly conceived and wrongly understood and wrongly misunderstood. Nobody thinks Libya was a success, because the media, however absent they were in the critical moments, have actually basically recorded that Libya was a farce and a fiasco, and that the way in which outside intervention from the air simply demolished the regime without any kind of concept of what was going to follow it. People are aware. I don't think you have to be sophisticated, because I actually think you did a good job.
I have to comment here, John, because you mentioned our friend Lindsay Hilson, who's now in Syria, and she wrote on Twitter this week that she must have sent an email to one of her friends to say finally she was getting into Syria, and her friend said, oh, you're going to Syria? Is that civil war still going on? And she said, oh my God, it makes us really ask what kind of a job we're doing. I'm sure that person was living on a mountain really far away somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very, very much indeed. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm the former intelligence analyst in Customs and Excise for transnational organised crime and the ex-Soviet states, which some people might suggest is two sides of the same coin. My question is based on Mr. Lloyd's comments about governments lying to us, which, amen to that, they call it economical with the truth, but it is lying. I've seen them lie in when I was in the service in relation to the murder of a member of staff who was killed on duty in his own office. And they omitted to the extent that it amounts to a lie. My question for the panel is, regarding the comment, we are the storytellers, not the story. What has changed in the last 10 years about pressure from your own management or proprietors to be able to speak out freely as you see it or not? Has it got better, worse? How is it different, if it is different?
It's a good question from the man with the best byline in the building. Please.
Well, I work for a public broadcaster. You can say our philosophy is on the one hand and on the other hand, but I can say that in 30 years I've never been told by the BBC that I can't say this or shouldn't say this. I mean, there's sometimes a discussion about language, especially when you work in certain parts of the world, but I've never been, I don't know whether my colleagues would agree with me, but we're generally given a lot of authority when we go out to the field, that they send you out with the trust and respect that you will report the story as honestly as you see it. And that's not to say that we don't sometimes make mistakes, but I'd like to believe that they're honest mistakes, that you perhaps didn't speak to that one extra person. The next day you can speak to them and develop your story further, even sometimes correct your story. But I haven't had to pull my punches, not knowingly anyway.
Bill?
I completely agree. It's never been suggested to me that I tone things down, or I honestly can say I have carte blanche. The only thing that we sometimes do, and again it's a battle that we all fight daily, is it's about images.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I feel very strongly that if there's war done in our name, then you've got to show that it's war. And you've got to show some very uncomfortable images. And I think we've become far too squeamish in the last 10 or 15 years about showing
he's right
things
on
like that. And those are the battles that I've fought, and I have to say sometimes lost. But in general terms, on editorials line, no, really, not at all.
There's a microphone coming.
Thank you. It's Carol Story, and I'm a photojournalist. And it's a very interesting comment about having an image that can tell a story without a narrative, particularly when you're dealing with war. And I always think of one very exceptional, iconic image that we all know sitting in this room. Even if we didn't know the photographer, we will know the picture. And of course, it's Nick Ut, and it's the young girl running from being burned from napalm. And today we could never run this picture. It was an extraordinary thing that it actually was on the cover of Life magazine, a very conservative magazine, Americana, and so on. It was prefrontal. She was prepubescent, and she had everything there in full view. And I agree with you. I think, today the combination, the collaboration, which you gentlemen have an enormous amount of respect, is the idea of the narrative. But when you have an image that can say so much, and then the narrative is adding another dimension and insight and so on, is really important, because all we are sitting in this room who are journalists are messengers. We hope to bring the truth. I think we are, irrespective of all the things that have been going on in the press and celebrities bringing all sorts of slander and so on. We are the last bastions of bringing the truth to the public, and in an extraordinary way to illuminate what's happening in a world that perhaps they don't know. And sometimes I think to myself how privileged we are to be able to be in that position to do that, and to never give up, even if we get slammed and bammed and all the rest. And this picture I just recently...
Do you think if you took that picture now, do you think it would not be published? That's a very interesting point.
Let me give you...
I'd like to know what people here think.
It's true.
But it's a very important question, actually.
It is true, because I did a series of pictures which is about post-conflict in the DRC, just very recently. That's me next. And one of the pictures because it's about cross-border trade and the importance between the DRC and Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi. And there's one picture that it was for an NGO, and one picture is of a family. And it's sort of like they wanted to use it for their Christmas card. They thought, well, this will tell the story of the importance and the involvement with the World Bank and all the rest. And they wouldn't use the picture because there was a 3-year-old little girl, very cute, with a little bit of her nipple from the torn dress that she was wearing. And they asked me if I could please Photoshop. I said, no.
We thought maybe it was a Christmas card. I mean, I suppose we draw the
No,
line at
but,
Christmas cards.
well, I mean, it was
One day of the year at least, we know Christmas
No,
cards.
But I think you might be right.
But it is.
You might be right that Time magazine might not put that picture on the front page of the
That's
of the
exactly
Vietnam girl. I think that's very possible.
And it is possible because they said, well, you know, there's all sorts of rules, and it could be a pedophile that views this. And I'm thinking, she's only 3 or 4 years old.
Right.
It's with the family. And
Okay.
And interesting, just a quick point, there is video of that as well, shot by an ITN cameraman.
Alan Downs.
Called Alan Downs.
Yeah.
But because of the power of the photograph, that's what's usually seen. But no, it's an interesting point.
Anthony.
I think the counterpoint of that, striking a conservative chord here again, is that one needs to have some limit. I think we're all agreed on that. I mean, I see stuff at work that I wouldn't want people to see at home, you know, gristle and guts smeared up walls and children's heads on the floor. So one has to stop somewhere. I agree. I don't think Nikut's photograph would be used nearly as widely as it was then. I remember recapping on the gassing story, which I talked about at the beginning. The footage was very, very strong. It showed particularly the father, but also his children, with froth pouring out of their mouth and doctors shoving tubes in, trying to resuscitate him. This is in Syria. I remember debating with the photographer. We took a grab off the video footage, and I was like, I wonder if the paper are going to have the bottle to put that on the front. And that was an awful question to ask each other. We were like, that picture should be on the front. But we were dubious and we were doubtful. We were like, I wonder if they're going to bung it on the front. And in fact, we had a relatively new editor who was and a much more aggressive, perhaps, and he put it straight on the front, which surprised us. But yeah, I think it's a very good question. Would the picture of the badly burned little girl running down a street after a napalm strike in Vietnam be as widely used now as it was before? I don't think it would be in the Western media.
Well, I think your question has in fact sparked a very interesting response, Mr. Investigator of post-Soviet. Post-Soviet.
Probably investigated all of us.
I'd like to enter one other thing. I mean, we are regulated. I mean, us two. We're regulated by Ofcom. And it's very interesting because when I first became a journalist, if you saw a lawyer in the office more than once a week, it was a great rarity. Now there are 3 in there every night, and they're going through absolutely everything. And it's not libel, it is compliance. And compliance, I mean, is way above the editor's head. The editor can decide possibly to defy the compliance. The compliance is about balance, it's about decency, it's about all sorts of things. But actually the interesting thing is the lawyers toil to get it on the air. They don't toil to get it off the air. They toil to get it on the air. And they find ways in which you could say it, or you could show it. But it has to be contextualized. There has to be a warning 20 seconds before you show it, or whatever. So it's got more difficult, but it's strangely, you know something? I think I need regulating. No, I mean, I think a lot of us get emotionally turned up in these things. He certainly does. I saw him in Sri Lanka only last week. By God, did he get angry with them? Yeah, and they were worth getting angry with. They were toe rags. Yeah. Sorry, I saw you. Yes. Let's get 2 questions at once. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Santiago. I'm from Argentina. I've been living here for 16 years. I'm a software engineer. As well.
Another one.
Another one. Recently, I heard some concept of journalism for peace. I wonder, I thought it's a good opportunity to ask if it's possible. And in terms of, showing reality or the truth,
You mean journalists campaigning for peace?
No, journalism for peace. I recently heard about it as a concept.
I think we'd be very alarmed to be for anything except good journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I heard it in the conflict resolution talk. We talk about conflict resolution. So I heard that concept. So I thought, okay, it's a good opportunity. I'm a journalist here. It's a good opportunity to ask if it's possible. And if you see it, probably you don't see it yet, but in the future.
Well, I'm sure that if you could in any way be the agent of peace, you would pursue journalism for peace. But I imagine...
The understanding of people say that journalism for war, if there's no war, it doesn't make any headlines. But I think if we really stick to the really, really, really good ethics of journalism, if there's a conflict going on in Afghanistan, for example, I would say rather, I would go back to the earlier point I made, that if you're really sticking to the ethics of journalism, giving the both warring sides efforts and enough space in the reports we make, then what we can make is affecting the public opinion, and that can lead to peace. So indirectly, I kind of believe that if we do some good journalism, it can bring peace.
But it takes us back to something you said at the beginning about the vote in Parliament, about the war in Syria. Surely because British journalists had done a very good job on the wars and the failures of the wars, the public opinion was that they did not want to see another military adventure. And that, I think, suggests that the journalists have done a very good job.
I think you're right. I mean, the public get the vote. I don't think journalists as well should judge their professionalism by their ability to cause a reaction, whether that's a peaceful reaction or a belligerent reaction. As soon as you start reporting with the aim of affecting a change, you've compromised your ethics. I mean, you're sort of there to report on what's going on. Yes, peace would be, a nice idea, but if you start reporting with an idea in mind that your success is related by your ability to bring about peace, then it's going to compromise your reporting. It just doesn't work out that way.
There was a person. Oh well, I'll take you. Yes.
I don't know if I notice a contradiction, but on one side you're saying that...
Can you say who you are?
Roberto Russi, I'm a freelance journalist.
From?
From Italy, based here in London. So one side you say...
I'm sorry about Berlusconi, by the way.
Wow. At some stage it had to happen.
What are you going to write about now?
He's a refugee. He's a
What are you
journalist
going to write about
refugee.
now? You have 2 years in which you can't run for office.
We can hold a private ceremony downstairs after this. No, I wanted to say that on one side you claim that you got carte blanche, and you said that you've done a fantastic job, and I believe that you've done a great job, especially compared to what happens in Italy. But is there a contradiction between this and the fact that in 2003 British journalists failed to question the invasion of Iraq, which was based on I cut it short. And if now, or if recently, the public opinion was not so keen to go to war against Syria, was also because the public was kind of expecting a higher standard of proof to invade again another country. So, did anything go terribly wrong in 2003? Do you, as the British journalism learn something from there? Is it something we're reflecting on?
I remember to praise the BBC. I remember on the BBC's Today programme, a presenter called John Humphreys grilling government ministers before the invasion as hard as he possibly could about the imminent invasion. I feel, in spite of what I said earlier, in comparison to American journalism, and I don't know if there are any Americans or American journalists here, who...
Bill, you're an American journalist now.
Not yet.
Think America.
Who for many periods sleepwalked through their own history. After 9/11, there was almost a conspiracy of silence because it was a war or a war on terror of national importance and national survival. I mean, I would say in 2003, journalism did a decent enough job to try to hold truth to power, and pinned British music. Looking at America, I don't think they did such a good.
It was more
job.
difficult for them. I mean, if jets had slammed into the Houses of Parliament filled with British passengers, we would have probably gone ape too.
Don't deny that.
Yeah, but that in a way is where history has got sort of blurred, because the whole idea was to go in, take out the people who'd done this, knock off the Taliban and get out.
Yep.
And then the whole idea of the war, and this is where I think we did fail, we didn't spot what was happening, which was they suddenly decided they were going to build a Western democracy, which was, of course, one of the maddest endeavours time has ever known. I mean, completely bonkers. I mean, it's one thing to knock off the Taliban, which they did in 3 months. And then...
So, John, you would have been quite with Rumsfeld, really, just to go in, smash up the Taliban, pay off some militias and cut out.
Well, I can't think it would have done any more damage than we had done.
I tend to agree, but I'm just interested.
It's the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. And I'm with him all the way. Yes.
I'm James Harkin. I've been writing a bit about Syria. I'm from Belfast, but I'll avoid the temptation to drag the subject back to Northern Ireland. Two very quick and loose questions aimed at, I suppose, taking stock of the last decade. One of which is, I'm curious about the role of media blackouts and denotices, and whether any of the panellists think that those have increased or decreased in the last decade, because they strike me as rather nefarious. Secondly, in terms of the changing political economy of journalism, especially in the print media, I wondered whether you have any views on the rising role of freelancers and citizen journalists, and either the advantages or possibly the disadvantages, in fact, of the effect of that on journalism in terms of its responsibilities and the profession itself.
Thank you. Two very good questions. Lise.
I would just say that, especially because we're meeting at the Frontline Club, we should really salute freelance journalists, because they go in still, despite the fact that there are now freelance organizations, despite the fact that there's courses for freelance journalists, including in security training, that there are ways to support them, that they still go in without enough protection, not paid enough. They take huge risks, because most freelancers that I've met are incredibly committed to the storytelling, and they go in with a wish and a prayer often. And I think the figure was that if you take the Syrian war, that 80% of the writing is being done by freelancers. I think you've heard that figure before. And when Frontline Club set up its freelance register, it expected maybe some dozens of journalists. Hundreds have signed up. So it's good that there's a lot of freelancers, but it's also it gives you pause for thought.
New media, Anthony.
Sorry, say that again, John.
New media.
New media. I'm quite hard. I was a freelancer until about 9 months ago, over a course of 19 years. I'm quite hard-asked about freelance. I think there is a law of natural selection there. I think it's inevitable that cycles, generations of journalists attract freelancers, that some of them are killed or wounded, but as a period of time goes by, many peel off and go into other professions other than journalism, and a few remain and become very good. Can we do more? Yes, we probably can, but there's always going to be a vacuum that attracts freelancers in, and I think the profession is much more healthy for it. On the subject of blackouts, I want to say something very quickly, because it really burns in my mind at the moment, is that, as I understand it, the figure is there are 15 Western journalists about hostage, captive, or disappeared in Syria, including British citizens. We've got John, we've got friends Jim Foley and all the rest of it. Now, apparently we labour under the advice of security companies, private security companies, and sometimes the Foreign Office, saying, hey, best not to talk about them, best not to print anything about them. And we appear to concur with that. I mean, these guys and these women, we believe most of them are probably still alive, probably some of them have been murdered. They're going to probably come out at some point over the next few years. And I know if I was in a dungeon in Aleppo, I'd like to think that everybody back here was talking about my fate, at least. They're going to come out someday and say, hey, I hope you're all talking about me while I was missing. Well, we don't. Why don't we? I don't know.
But sadly, families are persuaded that that's
Some of
best
them
route.
are.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, but the families
some
are leaned on quite
I know,
heavily
but that's what I mean.
too.
You feel badly because that's the advice. that
I
they're
feel
giving
very
you.
awkward about
Well,
this. I think it's a very
governments don't
unresolved
want
issue.
pressure from their own citizenry to get people out.
Yes, but that's
I'm
exactly.
saying that,
Well, I
sardonic.
think that's. I think it's partially true. I think. It's
You wanted to say something about new media?
Just quickly, two things, both on new media and freelancers. And just a year ago, I was a freelancer, and again, because of the what the main big media organizations' interests are as freelancers, we have been more. I have been personally thinking what really makes a good BBC or Channel 4 thing, rather than thinking what a good freelancer journalist can make a good story. So following the path of what can make a good story. What can make which story can make it to the BBC. On the social media, it's a good thing if we really call it this citizen journalism. First, I learned this expression at City University in 2006 when I did my master's degree, which I thought it's a good thing. But unfortunately, afterwards, I realized the negative impact of citizen journalism or the social media on good journalism and mainstream journalists. Recently, I worked with a journalist at Channel 4, and he was introduced to me. He's so and so. He's so good, and he has got 200,000 followers. And unfortunately, when working with some very good friends in the field, when you're up after a very good investigative story, the person, he or she, is mostly involved in tweeting every hour or so because he has to keep the level of tweets. I think if you really leave social citizen journalism to citizens and we really do some good journalism while we are focused on one particular story, and I kind of see that social media has also the downside and good journalism as well. And one last thing, that in Afghanistan, again, some people judge, some correspondents say 20% of Afghans believe this. On the social media, 1,000 Afghans said this, and they're making even opinions, while guess what, of the 30 million Afghans, only less than 1 million will have access to internet, but they're judging the opinions from the social media. That's the downside.
Just the tarmacs.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Better than the one taxi driver they used to talk to.
Look, aren't freelancers wonderful? They save our ass so many times. Northern Syria, for example, right now, where a lot of us are reluctant for all sorts of reasons to go. We are taking quite a lot of material from people who go in there and shoot. Just one quick point. I was talking to the guy who runs the Brown Moses website the other night, who told me that he reckons there have been 500,000 videos so far from the Syria conflict, which presents us with both a great opportunity and a huge challenge as journalists. And I think when we talk about the next 10 years, this is something that, you know, it will be difficult. This is a video jungle. I don't like the term citizen journalist. I welcome a lot of these videos because otherwise how could we have covered certainly the early days of street protests, but I think it also represents a danger for us. And just one quick anecdote about how other groups are learning what we do and using it for their own purposes. My last trip to Syria, the last story I did was in the Christian town of Malula, which was taken by insurgents and then apparently retaken by government forces. Anyway, I drove in and it was quite clear it wasn't retaken by government forces. We were shot at, etc., etc. Anyway, a few days later, I saw on YouTube a video produced by the Jabhat al-Nusra group who had gone in. It was shot from 4 different angles, from the 4 areas that they'd gone in to take the town of Malula. At least 2 of those vehicles had GoPro cameras, so steady shots on the back. They had filmed and, as usual, interviewed the suicide bomber before he blew himself up, filmed the suicide bomber as he blew himself up. This was a slick production, 35-minute video, well edited, in HD. And that is what, groups are now doing, and that is the challenge that we face. Do you use that video, or do you not use that video? Which of the 500,000 videos that are pouring out of Syria are you going to use? Which, as journalists in the next 10 years, are we going to use? I mean, I think that's one of the big challenges. We love YouTube and we love all the new, fangled things that we can use as hacks, but there's a danger in there as well. But freelancers, God bless them.
I can't let it pass without mentioning that I keep my Twitter feed open during the programme, and I have to say I follow President Rouhani. I don't want to sound like an Iran obsessive, but he tweeted at 7:07, about 9 days ago, that he'd just got off the telephone with David Cameron, first president to speak to a British Prime Minister in 11 years. And Downing Street, interestingly, didn't release it till 55 minutes later. But I have investigated Rouhani's Twitter feed, and I'm satisfied that it is him. Very satisfied that it's him. He is sparing, but he is always right. I mean, in terms of it is definitely in tune with what he thinks. And therefore I trusted it. And I checked with the producer. I said, he's just got off the telephone from David Cameron. I mean, you can ring Downing Street if you like, but I personally think we can go with it. And we did. And 55 minutes later, Downing Street confirmed it. And now you might say that was rather rash, but I thought it was rather exciting. Yes.
My name's Olivia. I'm a cameraman for Russia Today. Building on the last question, quite similar, and the answer given, as well as the rise in freelance journalism and citizen journalism, do you think the emergence of affordable technology and the change in technology means that also international journalists such as yourselves are encouraged to become one-man band type reporters? Do you think with the cuts in budgets and that sort of thing, that's a trend that has happened or is going to happen, where you you take photographs, you film on your little camera, your GoPro or your iPhone, and you report, or is that not something you have experienced?
Please.
Well, first of all, Olivia, I have to say you've achieved the impossible. You've become a cameraman in a one-man band. Well done. Very good. I think all the technology is very exciting, and if you talk to young journalism students, they learn everything. They learn, my niece is at journalism school, and she came in and so I said, here's the editor, here's the producer, here's the cameraman, here's me. She goes, I want to do it all myself. I want to take the pictures, edit the pictures, produce the pictures, and tell the story. Why would I let someone else do it? And I thought, how do I explain to a 19-year-old that actually maybe it's better to do it the other way? And I think it's a very exciting development. I still like doing the kind of journalism which has more than one people, especially when you're in an area of danger or difficulty, to someone to watch your back, and so that people can concentrate on what they feel they do best. And I'm a big believer in two eyes are better than one. Four.
In 1990, I went to Iraq, and we took all our heavy equipment, and we went in and we did a story, and I brought it along to the state TV station, which we all used to use, and Mrs. Awatif, the censor, was there. And before the feed, she said, I want to see your piece. So I pressed the button, and she said, no, this can't go out, because I'd said Saddam Hussein's palaces, and she said, Saddam Hussein does not have palaces. The people of Iraq have palaces. You will not get this piece through. Today, we don't do that. We go to our hotel rooms, we edit in our hotel rooms, and we feed on the internet. From Syria, from lots of places. I mean, that is one of the big technological changes of the last 10 years, that we are able to use tiny pieces of equipment. I mean, I remember Gaddafi going into the Rixos Hotel. Nick Robertson of CNN was, he had his iPhone up here and he had it on Streambox. So it was broadcasting back to CNN. And I could see it because the TV was behind me. And he had another phone and he was broadcasting live. And Gaddafi came in and you could see the picture, and he was commentating live, and it was going out behind me. Now that would have been absolutely impossible even 10 years ago, I think. Whereas, and that's the great technological advance that we have. But there are also dangers in that, and I think they're becoming more and more apparent, because governments know that we have that technological advantage, and on the battlefield that's very dangerous for armies and very dangerous for government. So, I think with every technological advance, and we all love having lightweight kit, but as journalists there are also dangers and challenges for us in those advances.
And the mass media has died, as we would have understood it from 10 years ago. The mass media probably still had traction as a phrase, and we represented the mass media, and the mass media is now dead. Who watches in Britain the sort of television we're involved with, the newspapers that we're involved with, or who reads them? A very, very small percentage of people. They have an infinitely broader spectrum of news resources to go on. They'll be looking the war in Syria. There'll be people looking at blogs and all the rest.
We're not speaking the same language. I mean, the fact is that they consume television in a different way. They consume journalism in a different way. They may not watch the way you put it out, but they'll watch it. They watch it either online, they pick and mix, they watch it on YouTube, they watch it in all sorts of manner of different ways. We were told at the beginning that the internet was about content. And so it is. And there's a fantastic lack, can you believe it, of content. Because although there's 500,000 films, people want mediated material coming out by people they trust. And they are looking for it mainly online, but still, to some extent, you don't write off the oldies, they're still watching it to some extent on television. Television survived longer than we thought. Even newspapers have survived a bit longer than we thought. But everybody is now multi-platform, and we will survive. We haven't entirely monetized it, but we will survive because we are content. And content demands not that you decide everybody has to be a one-man band, but that it's a horses for courses. There are moments when you can only use a mobile phone. We broke into a private party in New York in which the Australians and the British were throwing a party for the loathsome creeps that run Sri Lanka. It was whiskey everywhere, and the rest of it was a disgusting thing. Here on the face of it, were they criticising these people for murdering 40,000 of their people, and on the other hand, they were supping whiskey and wine with them, and the mobile phone captured the lot. And that was nice. But generally speaking, you would want, in any situation, to have more than one person, for all sorts of different reasons, which you spelled out. But we're in the golden age of journalism. We have entered the golden age of journalism. Far more people are consuming our material than ever before in history.
But they're consuming material from a far broader band. It's not just us. 20 years ago it would have been just us. It's positive. It's positive. It's Pandora's box. It's good and bad.
But I mean, every day I tweet the Atlantic or whatever it is. I mean, the New York Review of Books. I mean, whatever, something which I think people may not necessarily have seen, I'm sending it out. It's fantastic. It is a great age. Wonderful. We're liberated.
I have to comment
people are looking into Jabhat al-Nusra as well.
I have to comment on, because Bill's mentioned about the censorship before, and we can access the technology, but so can everyone else. And I'm sure you've had these moments as well in Syria, where you're out filming somewhere, and then you realize that there's intelligence people behind you, and they're filming you filming something. So you see them, so you decide to film them filming you filming something, and it becomes a sort of a spy versus spy sort of thing, you know. Anyway, everyone has a camera.
Tom Coughlin, I'm a journalist. But just to follow on from what you've just said, they're consuming it, but they're not damn well paying for it.
No, I said we have to monetize it somehow. I don't know how that will be, but people want it. I mean, how often has somebody said to you, there are 800 channels of television, and I don't feel I've got any more than I used to have on 4. Yeah. And it's true, because there's crap. I mean, there's people selling soap powder, it's people taking their clothes off, it's whatever it is. Generally speaking, the splurge that the digital age has given us has not necessarily destroyed the desire for quality. And we have quality. You write quality. You are quality.
Thanks very much.
And that's it. Yeah. That's it. And people have got a wider chance of getting you than they ever had before.
They certainly have, but as we were saying, they're not prepared to pay for it, and so the quality is at an ever greater price in terms of newspapers, particularly having to cut journalists, to cut wage packets, which
as soon as the web works out micropayments, as soon as it's possible to pay a penny for something, and you pay a penny every time you hit it, whatever, and nobody minds paying a penny or tuppence. They will generate huge sums of money. But it hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. It's bound to happen, because people want decent content, and they'll pay for it. I'll pay tuppence. We've only got 5 minutes left, so you better cram them in.
2 points, really, leading on from that about funding. I'm sort of fed up with... I'm Adam Smith. I'm a journalist. I write about...
You wrote a great economic treatise.
Yes.
so young.
We need you.
And since then, I've been writing about the politics of science in the UK, which is a lot less dangerous than what we're talking about tonight.
It's another front line, though.
Yes.
In a way, it is. It is. I'm sort of fed up of people of journalists and talking to journalists about how we're going to monetize whatever it is, YouTube or Twitter or anything like that. Because I think that's a navel-gazing conversation that journalists are having amongst themselves. Why aren't journalists actually pitching that story to editors, the story of the future of information, the future of journalism, and why that's going to be really important to democracy and everything else to actually get that sorted? Why isn't that really a much, much bigger story than it is? So that's a comment, and I'd receive any comments on that. And then related to that, really, and to bring it back to, I suppose, what we're discussing tonight is the funding for the journalism that you all do on the panel. I mean, whether you work for a corporation funded by the state which is prosecuting the war that you're covering, or whether you are funded by a company where it's never quite clear whether the masters are the advertisers or the viewers or shareholders or whoever. I wanted to ask you all whether you ever think about the funding for your own journalism and how your coverage, not your individual coverage, but the coverage might be different under different models.
Anthony, do you ever think of the funding of your journalism?
I just take the money and run.
As fast as you can.
No, I mean, I think there is an ease with which we say, and I would say it too, that I've never been aware of being lent on by the Times in order to write something in a certain way. Never ever. But if you step back more and say, well, yes, but actually, who do I represent? The education I've had, the place I've been, the class of society I'm born into, the people I work with, and all the rest of it. And it's pretty inevitable that no one has to lean on me. I sort of am going to probably go along. My perspective is going to be a certain perspective. I never feel a conscious clash with the funding I'm given. I mean, I'm being slightly facetious saying I take the money and run. I'm relieved that I feel I have a freedom in the way I operate that relies on my own intuition and common sense. Other people would argue that intuition and common sense is very prejudiced to begin with before we even get into who's paying me.
Anyone who says the money doesn't matter is just wrong. I mean, Anthony's funded by Murdoch. Lee's is funded by the taxpayer. We three in the middle, especially you, are, I think, in some senses, the paupers. At ITV News and Channel 4 News, we think every single day very hard about what we cover and how we cover it, and we have to box very clever because we don't have their money or Murdoch's money, and a lot of the stuff that you see on TV, sadly, comes from those kinds of tough decisions. Why don't we spend 2 weeks in the Democratic Republic of Congo, digging in? Because sometimes actually we just can't afford it. Why don't we spend more time, in some war zones? Well, actually, because sometimes our organizations demand that we have a security man who costs $1,000 a day, or 2 or 3, and those things are therefore hard for our companies to justify. We run on very, very tight budgets. And
You're going to be all right now. You've got General Electric behind you.
not anymore. It's Comcast.
Oh,
there you go. But news generally doesn't make a profit. I used to work for the BBC. It's wonderful that we have the BBC in Britain, which is paid for by the licence fee, and it's part of the glory of British journalism. But money matters.
I'm impressed by Channel 4 because, to be absolutely honest, British Airways is carrying 100,000 holidaymakers to Sri Lanka this year, and we're not getting any of that advertising. Not a bean of it. Not one bean. And I presume that is a sacrifice they've had to make in order to stick by the journalism of their correspondents. Please. Do you think about the money?
Well, I'm a Canadian, but I pay my taxes in Britain. I'm very aware. I can't speak for everyone at the BBC, but we're constantly reminded that it is funded by the taxpayer, that it's license fee. We are constantly asked, are we doing the kind of stories and telling them in a way that is of interest to the British public? We're constantly asked, can you explain what this really means? Could you try to tell the stories that matter to people. I try to tell very human stories no matter where I go, because I think that's the stories that everyone is interested in, stories about mothers, fathers, children, relationships, friends, neighborhoods, etc. It is a great privilege, as Bill would say. It's a great it's a great advantage being for a public broadcaster. But as you know, there's a big debate now as to whether or not it will continue, whether or not it will be shared with other broadcasters, and how long the British public will want to pay for the BBC. And that will be a question for everyone who lives in Britain.
I think Afghanistan is a very good example towards your question, because we have nearly 40 plus nations in Afghanistan, and we have journalists coming from Australia only interested in Uruzgan because Australian troops are there. We have so and so journalists coming from this country because the only interest in that particular province or district because of the troops of that nation is involved there. And there's other indirect, perhaps, side effects of the funding or donations is I even hear British journalists or non-British journalists sometimes reporting, saying our nations, our troops, our war. I think all of these, ethically as a journalist, is wrong, whether it is because of the effect of funding or it's because of the post-9/11 culture of reporting that I can see in Afghanistan.
I completely forgot that we can look in the future, so for the last 30 seconds, each person on the panel, you have to tell us the one thing that you think you will be reporting on in the next 10 years. Anthony.
I don't know if I'll be reporting on it, but I think there's a tendency sitting here, I could sit here and think, 10 years' time, Shia-Sunni divide, there's going to be a lot more of that, a lot more fighting about mineral resources and all the rest of it. But actually, I'd bring it back home. I think we live in a very, very difficult era in Europe. If you look at Europe, the only time that multiculturalism has existed peaceably has been at times of tremendous economic stability. Well, now we're on the verge of the biggest population movements probably seen since the Second World War within Europe. We have, in 10 years' time, we're going to have huge trenches of society who don't feel in any way represented by the government, the armed forces, or institutions like the police, who have radically different understandings of democratic values and liberalism to us. And looking at history in Europe, I'd say certainly in 10 years or for our children's generations, those people inside Europe are going to be in for a rough ride.
Bill?
I don't know where we'll be, but we've got to be there. because
quote of the evening.
Because Twitter just doesn't replace boots on the ground. And I think the great challenge for us maybe the Syria vote and America's reluctance to be involved in anywhere proves, maybe the West is pulling back a little bit. But that doesn't mean we as journalists have to pull back from the consequences of the last 10 years. I think it's absolutely incumbent on us to remain true to everything that journalism is supposed to be about, to be a witness to history, to shine a light in dark places, and to tell people, at least to say to people, so people cannot say to us, we didn't know. We've got to be there so they know, wherever that is.
I think even though Osama bin Laden is no more, but I see, at least for the next 10 or even 20 years, war and terror, war for democracy will continue to be a subject of the next 10 years, particularly in South Asia and particularly in Afghanistan.
Please.
I'll go back to a point I made earlier. For me, journalism is about asking questions. And the questions we ask is a result of our life experiences, the things that matter to us as persons. And I think it's a very exciting time in journalism. If I go back to when I started with the BBC, I slipped in with my funny Canadian accent behind the Scots and the Welsh who were allowed to read the news for the first time. And because there wasn't any email then, you had to care enough about my terrible accent to actually go to the post office and write your letter and buy stamps and send the letter to the BBC. Now you look at the BBC, there's more Shoaib Sharifis than there are Bill Neelys. There are people coming from all kinds of backgrounds, with all kinds of accents, with all kinds of life experiences, all asking different questions. And I think it's a great, great strength of journalism. And there are days where I go to work and I think someday I'm going to be out of a job. So I'm glad I'm at the end of my career rather than at the beginning of my career. And I think this is the greatness of journalism. More and more people are joining it from different parts of the world. There's very strong and vibrant local media. And I will end with what Bill has said, that there is simply no alternative to being there on the ground in the heat and the dusk, asking questions face to face with someone, because until you see their face, you really, really don't know what their answer really is. And I hope that that strength of journalism and storytelling will continue. We'll absorb it in different forms, we'll read it or take it up in different forms, but I hope it's there because it's the essence of journalism.
And for what it's worth, I think that we will awaken finally to the reality that the real front line is climate change and global warming, and that is one of the forces that will unite humanity as water wars give way to some kind of understanding globally that we all have to pull together to save the world in which we live. I'd like on your behalf to thank Shoaib, Lise, Anthony, Bill, and particularly Millicent for setting this up, and the Frontline Club for being 10.
Yeah.